On the evening of March 27, 1937, a 20-year-old woman named Veronica Ronnie Gideon walked alone down a dark street in New York City. She hugged herself against the early spring chill as she made her way to the home of a man she barely knew. Ronnie's boyfriend had left for the Easter weekend to visit his family, so he had asked his best friend to keep an eye on Ronnie while he was away. That friend had invited Ronnie to his place for dinner and then an evening of drinking and dancing. And that's where Ronnie was headed right now. She was feeling a bit nervous, but also excited, and she was wearing one of her favorite outfits, a pretty blue tea dress. Ronnie thought it was pretty funny that her boyfriend was so worried she might cheat on him that he had basically set her up on a date tonight himself. Sure, a second man was going to join Ronnie and her boyfriend's best friend, but that just meant Ronnie would be out on the town with two men that were not her boyfriend. And they planned to stay out at the bars until they closed at 3 a.m. But even if she didn't admit this, Ronnie did understand why she made her boyfriend nervous. She was totally gorgeous, with a bubbly personality and a quick sense of humor. She also had a modeling career that was really starting to get her noticed, too. In fact, recently, she'd started to think she could actually become a famous model. Only a few days earlier, the latest issue of Inside Detective magazine had hit newsstands all over the city, and there on the cover was Ronnie herself. In the photo, she looked terrified, with one arm shielding her face and the other covering her bare chest. The picture was supposed to illustrate an alarming story called Party Girl, about unmarried young women who like to drink and have premarital sex until they all get sent to jail for immorality. In the 1930s, true crime magazines that featured barely dressed young women in danger were enormously popular, and Ronnie had appeared on several covers with headlines like "Pretty but Cheap" and "I Am a White Slave." But the real Ronnie was nothing like those pictures. She liked to go out and have a good time, but she wasn't wild. She had only been in love one time, when she was 16 years old and she eloped with a family friend named Bobby Flower, but that marriage ended disastrously after only a few weeks. And for many nights after that breakup, Ronnie felt heartbroken about losing Bobby, and she'd write about him in her diary until she fell asleep. And now, 4 years later, despite having a new boyfriend, Ronnie wasn't actually looking for love. She was just looking to have fun. And what better place than New York City, Ronnie thought as she stepped off the curb to cross Fifth Avenue. And at that moment, a yellow taxicab zipped by close enough to make Ronnie jump back and jolt her out of her daydream. And then, after collecting herself, she looked up and she could see she was just a few blocks away from Steve's place near Central Park. Steve's neighborhood was way more fashionable than Ronnie's. Ronnie still lived at home with her mother, Mary Gideon, in a tiny fourth-floor apartment near the East River. Ronnie found her home to be pretty depressing. Her mother had been unhappily married to her father, Joseph Gideon, for decades, until her father had left the family 3 years earlier. Joseph was a sour man who repaired furniture for a living, and he did not approve of Ronnie's love of the nightlife. Ronnie had been relieved when he moved out, though he still had a key and came over on holidays and on some weekends. But even without Ronnie's dad around, the apartment was still overcrowded. This was the Great Depression, and people often rented extra rooms to strangers to raise extra money. One of Mary and Ronnie's roommates was a boarder named Frank Burns, who lived in one of the bedrooms and joined the family at dinner each night, and the other boarder was one of Ronnie's friends, who was just staying temporarily. So lately, Ronnie had been sharing the same bed as her mother. Ronnie loved her mother, but she sometimes felt like the walls were closing in when they would spend the evening together listening to the radio in their tiny living room. It was even harder when Frank joined them. He was partially deaf, and her mother had to turn the radio up super loud just so he could hear his favorite show, Amos and Andy. And Frank was just one in a parade of boarders who intruded on Ronnie's family life. Ronnie recalled one other boarder, a struggling artist named Bob Irwin, who wanted to marry her big sister, Ethel. Her sister was a very beautiful woman, but who hid her beauty behind horn-rimmed glasses and hair that was pulled into a tight bun. She said she was not interested in Bob, but Bob never gave up. He continued to drop in on the family even after he had moved out. In short, the apartment had long felt like a prison to Ronnie. By comparison, she felt absolutely free when she went out to the bars and clubs of New York. Just then, Ronnie passed by the famous Radio City Music Hall where she had seen the movie Snow White with her boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, a couple of months earlier. And they had had so much fun, Ronnie remembered, and the colors were totally amazing. Lincoln liked to tell people that the two of them were engaged, which was not actually true, but they were a pretty good couple. And thinking about this made Ronnie feel kind of strange that she was now about to go have dinner and drinks with Lincoln's best friend. Ronnie approached the front door of her boyfriend's friend, Stephen Butter, a little before 8 p.m. As she climbed the front steps, she could hear big band swing music blaring from Stephen's radio. She rang the bell. Moments later, Stephen, who was dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit complete with a pocket handkerchief, opened the door and welcomed Ronnie inside with a theatrical bow. This was going to be a fun night. For the next 6 hours, Ronnie lost herself in the evening with Stephen and his other friend. They had planned to go bar hopping, but they were having such a good time dancing to the radio music while drinking gin and beer that they just stayed at Stephen's place until quite late. Stephen expected Ronnie to make them dinner, but she wasn't offended. The kitchen was considered women's work in those days, so Ronnie made a pasta dinner for all three of them. Stephen was not quite as handsome as Ronnie's boyfriend, and his family was not quite as wealthy. But Ronnie thought he was still very charming and had lots of promise. He was working on Wall Street after all, and the more gin and beer they drank, the more they flirted and danced cheek to cheek. Finally, at 2 a.m., Stephen's other friend called it a night and went home, but Steve and Ronnie decided their night was not quite done. They threw on their coats and they headed for the Monte Carlo Bar and Grill, which was on the way to Ronnie's apartment, for a few more gin highballs. As Ronnie swallowed her last sip of alcohol, she thought about how her night might have turned out if she'd listened to her mother. Mary had wanted Ronnie home to help in the kitchen. Tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and they were expecting guests, Ronnie's sister Ethel and her husband, as well as their father. But Ronnie had secretly slipped out the door for the evening while her mother was still out shopping for the pork loin and green beans. Ronnie felt guilty, but not too much. By the time Steve escorted Ronnie back to her apartment building, they were leaning on each other to keep from falling down. But they both knew that since Ronnie was dating Steve's best friend, they shouldn't let things get romantic. So instead of a goodnight kiss, Steve offered to escort Ronnie to church the next morning for Easter Mass at 10, and she happily said yes. Ronnie let herself in the main building door and began climbing the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. She was a little dizzy from all the booze, but she felt lighthearted. Steve had been a good companion for the evening, and she was glad that she'd see him again in the morning. Ronnie walked in the door of her apartment at about 3 a.m., trying to be extra quiet so she didn't wake up the people inside, which included her mother and one of the 2 boarders named Frank. As for the other boarder, which was Ronnie's friend, they were out of town. Ronnie quietly ducked into the bathroom near the front door and undressed down to her slip. She took off her makeup and washed her face and hands. She brushed her teeth and then brushed her hair. And then finally, she was ready for bed, and so she tiptoed to the dark, silent bedroom where she and her mother slept. As she entered the bedroom, Ronnie couldn't see or hear a thing, not even her mother's breathing. And then suddenly, a hard object struck Ronnie in the face. It stunned Ronnie far more than it hurt her, but she was so terrified and confused, she didn't move an inch. And then a second later, a man's hand came out of the blackness and squeezed around Ronnie's throat and then shoved her roughly onto the bed. "Please don't touch me," Ronnie managed to croak in little more than a whisper, but the man just squeezed tighter. The next morning was Easter, and Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, woke up feeling totally hungover inside of the little room he had been renting since he separated from Ronnie's mother, Mary. But despite Joseph's throbbing headache from all the beers and shots of alcohol he had drank the night before, Joseph was actually in a great mood. He was going to have dinner with his family, and he and his estranged wife, Mary, had big news. After 3 years of separation, they were actually going to give married life another try. Joseph could not wait to tell his 2 daughters. Joseph slapped on his fedora hat and whistled as he walked the few blocks from his rented room to his wife's apartment, arriving a full half an hour before his 2:30 p.m. invitation. Not wanting to be rude by showing up early, Joseph found a payphone and called Mary, but no one answered. But Joseph didn't mind. He figured they must still be out at the Easter parade, and so in the meantime, he went shopping for gifts for his family, which included buying cigars that he planned to smoke with his daughter Ethel's husband to celebrate his reunion with his ex-wife Mary. But when Joseph returned back to Mary's apartment building and rang the front entrance door to the lobby at about 2:40 p.m., there was still no answer inside, and Joseph suddenly wondered if he had gotten the time wrong. Joseph was still standing right outside the main door of this building when his daughter Ethel and her husband came up behind him. Ethel told Joseph that he was right, the dinner was scheduled for 2:30 p.m., but she thought, maybe Mom might have the radio up too loud, and so she can't hear the buzzing of the bell when you ring it. And so Joseph nodded and tried the bell a couple more times, but still nobody opened up the front door. Eventually, another tenant inside the building heard all this buzzing and just let all three of them in the main door to the building. Joseph immediately bounded up the 4 flights of stairs to Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was going to give them a piece of his mind for leaving the Easter guests waiting outside. But when he got to the actual apartment door, leaving Ethel and her husband far behind, Joseph immediately knew something just wasn't right. The front door was not fully shut, it had not latched, and so when Joseph pushed on it just lightly, it flung open. And when he stepped into the living room, he saw Ronnie's little Pekingese dog named Tucci. Usually, Tucci would run right up to him, but today, Tucci stayed put and just sat there very reserved, with her ears flat against her head. Joseph called out for Mary and Ronnie, but there was only silence in the apartment. Joseph looked across to the kitchen and saw the pork, which was supposed to be today's dinner, sitting on the counter, obviously uncooked. Joseph went into the bedroom that Mary and Ronnie shared, but no one was there. Nothing was disturbed, except there were broken pieces of a bar of soap scattered all across the carpet. With mounting anxiety, Joseph then entered the second bedroom where Ronnie used to sleep until her friend moved in, and what he saw in there was worse than anything Joseph could have imagined. His daughter, Ronnie, was lying stark naked on the bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Her skin was the color gray-blue, and her neck was mottled with dark bruises. Joseph practically fell over in his haste to get out of the room containing his daughter's corpse. But when he stumbled into the third bedroom, there was only more horror. Frank, the boarder, was lying under the covers, the blanket right up to his neck, but his head was mutilated and covered in blood. Joseph could not take it anymore, and he just ran out of the apartment and began charging down the stairs while screaming, "They're all dead!" He breathlessly told Ethel and her husband about the terrible things he had just seen, and they both instantly went pale. But then Ethel asked, "Well, what about Mother?" Joseph said he had not seen her, and he just hoped she had escaped and ran to the police. And then Joseph did exactly that. He ran out of the apartment and then ran a block away to the neighborhood police station, where he reported what he had just found. Minutes later, Joseph returned to the apartment, now with a detective by his side. And almost immediately, the detective made another shocking discovery. He saw a foot sticking out from under the bed that Ronnie was lying on top of. Peering underneath, the detective could see there was another body. It was Mary Gideon, and she was fully dressed and had terrible bruising around her neck. Whoever had killed her had apparently tried to hide her body by wedging it beneath the bed. All 3 victims' bodies were very stiff by the time they were found. They had clearly all been dead for hours. By late Sunday afternoon, a small army of New York detectives, led by tough guy Assistant Chief Inspector John A. Lyons, had descended on Ronnie and Mary's apartment, and the flashbulbs of crime scene photographers popped in every room as they recorded details of the gruesome murders. The detectives found a single gray suede glove in Frank's bedroom, likely left behind by the killer. They also found Ronnie's torn silk panties behind the headboard where her body lay, suggesting it was her assailant who had removed her clothes, either before or after killing her. Aside from the corpses, though, the apartment seemed totally undisturbed. This was not a robbery. The killer came specifically for these people. Inspector Lyons concluded that the boarder, Frank, one of the victims, was probably killed first as he slept. Someone had stabbed him 11 times in the head, likely with an ice pick. His skull was nearly caved in. Both Ronnie and Mary had been strangled to death by someone's hands, and Mary, at least, had put up a fierce fight. She had bruises all over her knuckles. The detectives could not say for sure if the women had been sexually assaulted, but it seemed fairly obvious to Inspector Lyons that they must have. However, he would leave it to the medical examiner to confirm that detail. One other thing stood out to Inspector Lyons as he puffed on a cigar and watched another detective give Ronnie's dog a belly scratch. Why didn't the neighbors hear anything whilst 3 brutal murders were committed in the middle of the night? Tucci was the type of nervous little dog that barked incessantly at strangers, but apparently Tucci had not made a sound at all, or had just been so quiet that neighbors were not woken up by the dog. But to Lyons, the implication here was clear. Whoever committed what would soon be known as the Easter Sunday Massacre must have known this dog well, so much so that the dog did not bark when they saw this person. The next day, the murders made the papers. In New York, there were newspapers that warned of a, quote, sex fiend that was on the loose in the city and that he would surely strike again. The media really fixated on the fact that Ronnie was this beautiful model who was found in the nude, and so they eagerly printed these photographs from Ronnie's modeling work where she was in various states of undress. By coincidence, Ronnie had been murdered exactly 1 year after another sensational murder just down the street. A delivery man had snuck into the apartment of writer Nancy Titterton and then assaulted her, strangled her, and left her tied up naked in her bathtub. Now, the Titterton murder seemed to be happening all over again, the newspaper said. One newspaper said that all American women were now in danger from the rising wave of sex murders. Locksmiths reported a sudden increase in lock sales to men eager to protect their women from predators. Inspector Lyons felt his blood pressure starting to rise as he read the morning headlines while he finished his breakfast. A story about the murder described Ronnie as being this prize beauty who was slaughtered by a sex-crazed lunatic who was still on the loose. To Lyons, stories like these just made his job harder, whipping up public fears and putting pressure on the police to find the killer faster, which he felt just encouraged sloppy detective work. Just then, as if on cue, the police commissioner himself called Lyons. And he told him to take as many detectives as he needed because solving the Easter Sunday Massacre was now the department's top goal. By the time Lyons set off for police headquarters that morning, he had a plan to employ 75 detectives who would talk to everyone who lived near the Gideons, and they would talk to anyone who knew the Gideons over the past few years. This would be one of the biggest criminal investigations in New York City's history. And Lyons would make it clear to his massive team of investigators that they should not hesitate to get rough with people if they had to. One of the first people brought in for questioning was Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. At 4 p.m. that Monday, Joseph Gideon reported to the same neighborhood police station where he came running to plead for help the day before. This time, though, he was trailed by a gang of reporters who were shouting questions at him while he remained grimly silent. Joseph expected to be treated as a grieving loved one, but the police treated him like a suspect from the start. They fingerprinted him and made him empty all his pockets to be sure he had no weapons. Then they relentlessly grilled him with questions for 12 hours as detectives took turns trying to get Joseph to break down. But over the course of this interview, Joseph only grew more ornery. Joseph had an alibi. Well, sort of. He had spent Saturday evening drinking at a bar and playing skee-ball with some other people who could confirm he was there. But by the time his daughter and his ex-wife were killed sometime after 3 a.m., Joseph was sleeping off the bender in his bed with no witnesses. One detective called Joseph a liar for saying he had nothing to do with the heinous crime, so Joseph called the detective a liar right back. Police eventually had to let Joseph go at about 4 a.m. on Tuesday because they had absolutely no evidence that he had done anything wrong, but they weren't quite done with Joseph. When Joseph went to his furniture repair shop to open up for the day a few hours later, he found 5 detectives waiting for him. They immediately seized the long needles that Joseph used for working on upholstery to see if maybe they matched the wounds on Frank Burns' head. Now, Joseph complained very bitterly to police. He couldn't even do his job. Reporters who had been tailing Joseph saw him blow up at the police, and they immediately crowded around the little upholsterer. And this time, Joseph shocked them by saying really horrible things about his dead wife and daughter. He said that his daughter, Ronnie, was wild and willful and that she loved to tease men. Maybe one of them had finally killed her for it, he said. When one of the reporters suggested that the killer could be someone romantically involved with his wife, he scoffed. He said that his wife was so cold that men, aside from him, probably would not find her attractive. As Joseph was talking to these reporters, he showed no sign that he was actually grieving the loss of his family. Instead, he just seemed really, really mad. And so after a wave of newspaper stories printed Joseph's harsh comments, Lyons' investigators began focusing even harder on Joseph. He certainly seemed unfeeling enough to potentially have killed his own family. Now, the detectives were obviously very suspicious of Joseph Gideon, but that didn't mean anything he said to them they didn't take seriously. And so when Joseph suggested police should really look into all the men in his daughter's life to see if maybe they had something to do with it, the police said, yeah, we will do that. And so the police tracked down all the men who had dated Ronnie over the years, or Ronnie had been close to in some way, starting with Stephen Butter, the man that Ronnie had been with the evening right before she had died, the best friend of her boyfriend. Stephen had gone to pick up Ronnie for Easter Mass, as they had planned to, on Sunday morning. But when he got there, just before 10 a.m., no one answered the buzzer. And so Stephen went back home, perplexed, and he kept calling Ronnie periodically throughout the day until 3 p.m. when a detective answered the phone. The detective told Stephen they needed to talk to him right away, but didn't say why. By the time Stephen got to the police station an hour later, he was so nervous he was visibly shaking. But when police began speaking to him, he didn't really add much of value. Stephen didn't even know Ronnie was dead until he got to the police station. All Stephen could say was that Ronnie was a, quote, swell kid, and they had a, quote, swell time together. Lyons pretty much immediately dismissed Stephen as a suspect, but Ronnie's social life left investigators with plenty more men to talk to, and Ronnie had some seriously complicated relationships with men. When Ronnie's boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, spoke to detectives at his home, he alternated between praise for Ronnie as a sweet church-going young woman and slammed her as a party girl who often stayed out all night and loved to, quote, play the field with other men. Lincoln admitted that he worried his girlfriend would cheat on him when he was away, but he trusted his friend Stephen to keep an eye on her for him, which is why he had set them up to hang out that night. But Lincoln would say, despite the quarrels they had in their relationship, he loved Ronnie and was absolutely devastated by her death. Also, Lincoln had a solid alibi. He was 50 miles away with family when Ronnie was killed. Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby, came to the police station next for questioning, and he insisted he had no hard feelings after his marriage to Ronnie broke up. He said they were both too young to be married, and they stayed friends and even got together once in a while. He had last seen Ronnie a few weeks before her death when they went to a movie. At some point, Bobby would tell Detective Lyons that he really hoped they would find the murderer and send him to the electric chair. So far, Ronnie's love life had not produced much in the way of a suspect. Of all her partners, Bobby was probably Lyons' best bet, given the failed marriage, but both Bobby and Ronnie seemed to have genuinely moved on from each other. Then, one of Ronnie's closest friends suggested that police take a look at a sometime chauffeur named George Frenchy Guéret, who previously rented a room in Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was an eccentric man who wore his chauffeur's uniform even when he wasn't working, and he spoke in a heavy French accent. But behind his kind of goofy, harmless exterior, Frenchy had a criminal record. Most importantly, according to Ronnie's friend, He had fought with Ronnie's mother, Mary, over money. In addition, Frenchie had developed a crush on Ronnie, but she had no interest, and she told him to leave her alone. Two of Lyons' detectives visited Frenchie at his rented room a few blocks from Ronnie's apartment. There, they would find 2 bloody handkerchiefs, which Frenchie blamed on nosebleeds. Frenchie did have an alibi, saying he had spent Easter weekend at a buddy's apartment, but when the detectives visited that apartment, they found no less than 4 ice picks, including one that appeared to be blood-stained. By Monday afternoon, the late editions of the newspapers were speculating that Frenchie had committed these murders, perhaps with the help of the friend he stayed with that weekend. Police quickly arrested both men. But a police analyst determined that the stain on the ice pick seized by police was not blood, it was rust. And they had no other evidence to connect Frenchie and his friend to the murders, and so Lyons reluctantly let them go. At a crowded press conference on Tuesday, 3 days after the murders, Lyons showed serious frustration from the 3 days of nonstop investigating with little to show for it. He admitted that detectives were, quote, in the dark about who killed Mary, Ronnie, and Frank. There was one very small bit of good news, though. The coroner reported that there was no physical evidence that either woman was sexually assaulted. Maybe the killer was not a sex fiend after all. And so the detectives decided to redouble their efforts on looking into Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. Everywhere Joseph went in those first days after the murders, he was followed by reporters, giving him endless chances to say something to make his position worse. He knew that he was under police scrutiny, but he boasted to reporters that the police could not break him, and he flew into a rage when reporters questioned his whereabouts at the time of the killings. Adding to public suspicions, the walls of Joseph's shop were covered with French postcards featuring naked women, and he admitted to a fondness for erotica. One newspaper said that Joseph suffered from, quote, queer animal desires that prompted him to leave his wife. Maybe, the newspaper speculated, Joseph was driven by some perversion to kill his own family. On Thursday, April 1st, so 4 days after the murders, detectives returned to Joseph's shop to look for a long needle that they had missed on their first sweep. They had already confiscated most of Joseph's tools, but a sharp-eyed upholsterer who did not know Joseph, who just happened to see a picture in the newspaper of all of Joseph's equipment that had been confiscated, told police that it looked like one needle was missing. He said it was a foot-long, quote, regulator with a very sharp point that every good furniture restorer would have. And police knew this tool was plenty big enough to have been the weapon that killed Frank Byrne. Newspapers immediately started running with the story, referring to the missing needle as the Gideon death needle, but the detectives would never find it. However, in their search for this other needle, they would find something else very unexpected in Joseph's shop, an unlicensed, loaded .38 caliber revolver hidden in a corner. Since Joseph had previously told police that he did not have a gun, they had now caught him in a lie. When one of the detectives phoned Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons with this news, he was elated. Now, Lyons said, they had Joseph Gideon right where they wanted him. Lyons ordered his men to start trailing Joseph wherever he went, just like the reporters were doing. They were going to allow Joseph to attend the funeral for his wife and his daughter, but that didn't mean he'd be going alone. Lyons told them to give Joseph a police escort so that a law enforcement officer was never more than an arm's length away. Several thousand people were waiting outside McCabe's funeral parlor when the police car carrying Joseph Gideon pulled up on Thursday afternoon. People were out on the sidewalk, while many more were draped over fire escapes, looking out windows, and even standing on the roof. Many hoped for a glimpse of the man suspected of killing Ronnie and Mary, and when Joseph stepped out of the police car, surrounded by 4 detectives, someone in the crowd shouted, "There he is!" But before anyone could lay a hand on Joseph, the detectives hustled him through the mob and into the chapel. There, Mary and Ronnie lay side by side in open caskets, surrounded by flowers, many from Ronnie's male admirers, as well as artists that she had worked with. The chapel was absolutely full, but only a handful of people actually knew the victims personally. People such as her ex-husband Bobby Flower, her boyfriend Lincoln Hauser, and her boyfriend's best friend Stephen Butter, the last person to see Ronnie alive, aside from her killer. And there were a few people who had known the Gideons from the past, people like Bob Irwin, the young sculptor who had once boarded with Ronnie and Mary and asked Ronnie's older sister Ethel to marry him. Bob dabbed a tear from his eye with a handkerchief as the priest stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. After the service was over, several of the men who had loved Ronnie kissed her as they passed her casket and openly wept. As for Ronnie's father, Joseph, he would keep his composure inside of the chapel, but when they all made their way out to the cemetery, he would break down in heavy sobs as he watched his daughter and ex-wife lowered into the ground. As he wept, his other daughter, Ethel, ran over and gave him a hug and cried with him. After the burial was over, police did not wait. They immediately grabbed Joseph and took him directly to the police station, where they would question him for another 6 straight hours, shaking and occasionally slapping Joseph the whole time. Despite Joseph's emotional display at the cemetery, detectives still strongly suspected he had killed his own family members, and if they pressed hard enough, he would confess. But without that missing needle that apparently Joseph could have used to kill the boarder Frank, or some other physical evidence linking Joseph to the crime in some way, prosecutors were not able to charge Joseph with murder. And when Joseph continued to deny that he was the killer, the police went to their plan B, and they charged him with illegal gun possession and put him in jail for that. By early Friday morning, April 2nd, less than a week after the murders, jail guards were taking Joseph's belt, necktie, and shoelaces to prevent him from committing suicide. Then they led him to his cell. Joseph's mind was numb as he sat on his jail cell cot, staring up at the bare light bulb that lit up the cell. The police had been questioning him relentlessly since he found the bodies of his wife and daughter 4 days earlier, and when detectives weren't grilling him, reporters followed his every move and shouted more questions. He had slept no more than maybe a few hours the whole time. For just a second, Joseph recalled last Sunday morning when he had been so excited to tell his daughters that he was getting back together with their mother. And now that was all gone. Then Joseph Gideon fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons was amazed at Joseph Gideon's stubbornness. He was the leading suspect in a triple murder, but Joseph refused to give an inch, even when police questioned him for hours and tried to scare the man with threats, shoves, or slaps across his face. Lyons was hopeful that Joseph would crack after a few days in jail, but he knew that his team could not put all their hopes in just one suspect. After all, the case they had against Joseph was far from airtight. And one of Lyons' best detectives had found what looked like a pretty good piece of evidence pointing toward a different suspect, one that made it look like Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby Flower, was not who he appeared to be. The evidence found was Ronnie's diary. The entries from 4 years earlier in 1933, when she married Bobby Flower, oozed with love for him. She would do anything for Bobby. He was her soulmate. This tracked with what Bobby had told police. But in 1934, Ronnie's diary entries took a dark turn. She started writing about how Bobby seemed to be stalking her sister Ethel. Bobby was out of his head, she wrote, and she was afraid of him. The discovery suggested that Bobby Flower lied to the police about having, quote, no hard feelings for Ronnie. Now, Bobby looked like an obsessed and potentially dangerous liar. So, Detective Lyons went straight to Ronnie's sister Ethel. He figured she would be the best person to fill him in on the details of Bobby Flower's troubling past. When the detective arrived at Ethel's home in Queens, she greeted him cordially, but as Lyons started explaining that he wanted to hear more about how Bobby Flower stalked her, he watched as Ethel's face grew more and more puzzled. Finally, Ethel interrupted Lyons and just asked him, "What are you talking about?" and now it was Lyons' turn to be confused. He pulled out Ronnie's diary and began walking Ethel through some of the entries. At first, Ethel just stared at the little book uncomprehendingly. But when Lyons started reading her the passages about how Ronnie was afraid of Bobby and how Bobby wouldn't leave the family alone, a light suddenly clicked on inside of Ethel's brain. She put her hand on Lyons' arm to silence him, and with big, serious eyes, she said she knew exactly what Ronnie was talking about. Inspector Lyons walked out of Ethel's parlor, reeling from what she had just told him, but clear about what he needed to do. He now realized that he had been completely wrong in his interpretation of the diary. Now he had to learn more about Bobby, a lot more. He immediately dispatched one detective to Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital in upstate New York to pull Bobby's medical records. And when Lyons saw what the records contained, he and his colleagues became increasingly alarmed at the kind of person they were dealing with. Bobby had a history of mental breakdowns and sudden explosions of violence dating back to when he was just 14 years old. Once he tried to amputate his own penis and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a year and a half. In fact, he had just been released when he had met Ronnie. There was no time to lose. They needed to talk to Bobby right away. So they went straight to the boarding house where he was staying. Bobby wasn't there, but his journal was. In it, he ranted and raved about Mary and Ronnie and how they were the reason his relationship with Ethel had broken up. Meanwhile, other detectives have been going from store to store in the New York City area, trying to find who sold the killer the gray suede glove that was left behind at the crime scene. Eventually, they found a young clerk in a J.J. Newberry's department store who remembered selling the gloves to a man just a few short weeks before. And when this young clerk described the man, it matched the description of Bobby perfectly. Inspector Lyons now realized he had a new primary suspect, someone with a clear motive to harm the Gideons and who had been physically linked to the crime scene. Lyons had Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, released on bail from his firearms charges. He knew Joseph was not the killer, and early on Monday morning, April 5th, Lyons called a press conference to say that police now knew who committed the Easter Sunday massacre. And he passed out pictures of this new person to the gathered reporters. Soon, Bobby's face would be on the front page of newspapers all across America. Over the next 3 months, police heard dozens of rumors about where to find Bobby, but none of them panned out until late June, when a hotel employee in Cleveland reported that one of her coworkers looked exactly like Bobby. The man called himself Bob Murray, but she offered that it could be a fake name. Unfortunately, the woman decided to speak to this so-called Bob Murray person about his resemblance to the Bobby police were looking for, and it turned out it was Bobby. This startled him and gave him a warning that his cover was blown, and so Bob Murray jumped on the first Greyhound bus headed for Chicago, leaving the police empty-handed again. The media began to poke fun at the police's inability to catch their murderer, portraying him as this crafty fugitive who was capable of eluding a nationwide manhunt. But it was at this time, totally out of the blue, Bobby decided to just turn himself in. He figured that eventually he was going to get caught, so why not make some money first? He decided to call one of Chicago's big city newspapers, the Chicago Herald-Examiner, and sell his whole sordid story. On the evening of Saturday, June 26th, Bobby sat down with reporters to describe in detail his role in the triple murder 3 months earlier. But it would turn out this Bobby was not Bobby Flower, Ronnie's ex-husband. This was a very different Bobby. When Inspector Lyons had gone to Ethel's house with Ronnie's diary and started asking her about why Bobby Flower had begun stalking her, Ethel had been totally lost. Bobby Flower had been the love of Ethel's sister's life and had remained her friend until her death. But when Inspector Lyons started showing Ethel the actual passages of Ronnie's writing, it clicked for her and she realized Ronnie was talking about a different Bobby in her diary. Not Bobby Flower, but Bobby Irwin, the young sculptor who had once rented a room with the family and subsequently become infatuated with Ethel. And so the police had just confused the two Bobbies. Here's the real story of what happened to Ronnie and Mary Gideon and the boarder that was living with them, Frank Burns. Bobby Irwin was a down-on-his-luck 26-year-old sculptor who the Gideon family had taken on as a boarder in 1934, 3 years before the murders. Ronnie had been 17 at the time and was still recovering from her failed marriage to the other Bobby. Ethel had been 21 years old and was building a career as a secretary after her own marriage had just fizzled out. Both sisters at the time were avoiding romantic entanglements. But Bobby Irwin, who called himself Bob, even though Ronnie referred to him exclusively as Bobby in her diary, was a confident guy. He was sure that one day he would be recognized as one of the world's greatest sculptors, and he thought Ethel was totally beautiful. He had even convinced Ethel to sit for him so that he could create a sculpture of her head out of marble. And the end product, Ethel's whole family agreed, was totally striking. The sculpture version of Ethel was both beautiful and peaceful. Her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. While Ronnie had always thought Bob Irwin was very creepy, Ethel had actually found him very talented and charismatic at first. He would take her to art museums where he would tell her all about the great masters and how his own artistic technique, something he called visualization, would lead him to the top as well. Ethel enjoyed the outings, but when Irwin asked her to marry him one summer night as they walked on the East River waterfront down by the piers, she was floored. Ethel told Irwin no and said that she was already engaged to an aspiring lawyer. This would be the man that Ethel would later marry. She said she still wanted to be friends with Irwin, but Irwin was totally heartbroken. After that, living in the same house was very uncomfortable, and so Irwin moved out later in 1934. That had been the end of the story as far as Ethel was concerned, but the story was not over for Bobby Irwin. By March 27, 1937, the day of the murders, Bobby Irwin lived at a boarding house a short walk from Ronnie and Mary's place. He still hadn't made it big as an artist. That very day, in fact, he had interviewed for another job that did not pan out. And he blamed the failures of his life on Ethel. He decided he couldn't live with her being married to someone else, so he sharpened his ice pick and set out for the Gideon home. His plan was actually just to kill Ethel, but his plan was flawed. He didn't realize that Ethel did not live there anymore. She had her own place with her husband in Queens. No one was home in the apartment when Irwin arrived, so he waited on the sidewalk until Mary Gideon arrived. Mary was not scared of Bob Irwin at all. Despite his obvious pining for her older daughter, he seemed like a nice guy. So she let him follow her up to the apartment. Mary was tired and not eager to visit, but she was polite as Irwin pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw her. In reality, he was stalling for time in hopes that Ethel would arrive. Then Mary's boarder, Frank Burns, came home and said hello before quickly retiring to his own bedroom. Eventually, Mary got tired of this long visit and just told Irwin that he had to leave. But Irwin said he was not going to leave until he saw Ethel. And so Mary said, okay, well, I'm going to get my boarder to throw you out. And that's when Irwin lunged for Mary's throat, squeezing as tight as he could and holding on even as she scratched his face repeatedly with her fingernails. And he kept choking Mary for 20 minutes until she was completely still. Then he stuffed her body under the bed in one of the smaller bedrooms. Irwin was astonished that Frank did not come out of his room during all the commotion, but he didn't have time to think about the boarder. He was there to kill Ethel. It occurred to Irwin that Ronnie might be the next person to come home, not Ethel, and he didn't want to kill Ronnie. It's true that she had disapproved of his relationship with Ethel, but he didn't hold a grudge about that. So he walked into the bathroom and grabbed a bar of soap and put it inside of a sock. If Ronnie came home first, he decided, he would just smack her in the face with the soap and hopefully knock her out. Erwin waited for nearly 2 hours in the dark of the Gideons' apartment until finally he heard Ronnie's voice after 3 a.m. speaking to her little dog. And when Ronnie finally came into the bedroom where Erwin was waiting, he wound up and smashed her on the left cheek with the bar of soap inside of the sock, shattering the soap into pieces. But to Erwin's surprise, this vicious blow seemed to have no effect on Ronnie. She just stood there. So Erwin grabbed her by the throat and pushed her onto the bed. He would say that he did not want to kill her at this point, but she was just making it so hard. He tried to disguise his voice, hoping she wouldn't recognize him, but she spoke to him by name as he was grappling with her, and she told him he was going to get in trouble if he didn't stop. And this was just too much for Erwin, and so he would furiously choke the life out of Ronnie and then rip off her clothes just to make the attack look as degrading as possible. By then, it was after 5 a.m., Ethel had not come back yet, and so Erwin knew he just needed to leave. But first, he knew he had to get rid of Frank, the boarder. Now, Frank never came out during the 2 attacks on the women, likely because he was almost deaf and didn't hear them. But Erwin thought he just could not take any chances, so he crept into Frank's room and began stabbing Frank in the face with his ice pick again and again and again. Finally, after Frank was dead, Erwin headed for the door, his only regret being that he did not get to kill Ethel. The Chicago Herald and Examiner paid Erwin $5,000 for his confession. It was the most money Erwin had ever made in his life, but the cops arrested him before he could spend it. New York prosecutors said they would be seeking the death penalty, but Erwin would plead guilty on the eve of his trial and would be sentenced to 139 years in prison instead. On April 15, 2018, a 56-year-old woman named Yoshika Yasutake began dusting a piano inside of her family's very small and very clean home in the English village of Helmsley. Like she always did, after dusting the outside of this piano, Yoshika lifted up the lid and began individually dusting each of the piano keys. But as she did this, she was very careful not to press down accidentally on any of the keys and make a sound. That was the last thing she wanted to do. Every time Yoshika was in charge of cleaning the house, she always dreaded getting to the piano because she was so worried about making a sound. After Yoshika had finished dusting this piano, both outside and inside, she lowered the lid and then walked over to a bookcase right next to a window and began dusting each of the books. And as she did, she began to hear out the window the sounds of birds chirping and cars driving around and people chatting. And Yoshika, when she heard this, she stopped dusting for a moment and just looked out the window at the beautiful town, all the little stone cottages that lined the road. And as she looked out there and listened to the sounds of her village, Yoshika was struck with a sadness about all the things that she was missing out on. Once, Yoshika had been a world-class pianist. She had trained at the Royal College of Music, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, and she used to play packed symphony halls where sometimes in the audience would be literal members of the royal family. I mean, she was a really big deal. But Yoshika didn't play the piano anymore because her younger sister, Rina, had come back home. Now, as soon as Yoshika thought of Rina, she got angry and instinctively just turned and stared at Rina's closed bedroom door. And just for a moment, Yoshika wished that Rina had not come home. Because ever since Rina had come home, it was like all of Yoshika's family had decided that nothing else was important. Rina was the only thing that mattered. The Yasutake family consisted of Yoshika, as well as, of course, Rina, who was 49 years old, and they both had a brother who was 51 years old, and his name was Takahiro, and the 3 siblings' mother also lived with them, and she was 80 years old. As for their dad, he had passed away a few years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were both very impressive in their own ways. Yoshika had been this amazing pianist, and Takahiro was this amazing writer, but Rina was just on another level. Rina not only spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, and Japanese, but she also created her own dialect of Japanese with a complete system of grammar. Rena was also this unbelievable artist, and everybody wanted to buy her paintings, but Rena would never sell. Or if she did, it was quite rare, but that only created lots of hype around her artwork. It was like so valuable to get your hands on one of Rena's paintings. As a child, Rena had been awarded all these scholarships to all these prestigious private schools, and then after graduating high school, she was given a full-ride scholarship to the University of Cambridge, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so everybody assumed Rena was on track to become this world-famous artist. But there was something dark inside of Rena that no one could quite place. It only came out when she would have these sudden outbursts of anger, and people would see this side of her that just didn't line up with the rest of who she was. But these flashes of anger would often pass quickly, and so people kind of wrote it off as a byproduct of extreme genius. It was like her brain just sometimes couldn't quite handle how smart she was, and she would get mad and frustrated. But when Rena graduated from the University of Cambridge and came back home, she just was totally different. It was like something inside of her had snapped and stayed broken. A couple of days after Rena had come home, she had one of those sudden outbursts of anger, but Rena's anger never went away. She just stayed mad for days and days, and her family began asking her, like, what has gotten you so upset? But Rena refused to talk about it. And eventually, Rena just locked herself in her bedroom in the family home, and she would stay inside of there, refusing to talk to her family for weeks. And then when she did finally emerge after several weeks, it was clear Rena was just different. She basically refused to speak to anyone, family included, unless it was absolutely necessary, and she really never left the house or even her room unless it was totally necessary. And it would turn out this was not some post-college phase Rena was going through. This would become Rena's life. She basically became a total recluse inside of that bedroom for decades, to the point where the family's neighbors didn't even know Rena existed because she basically never came out of the house. Yoshika stopped staring at her sister's closed bedroom door and turned her attention back to the books on the shelf. She finished dusting them, and then after she was done cleaning the house. And so she put the duster down, and Yoshika very quietly tiptoed her way over to Rena's closed bedroom door, and very quietly she knocked. Rena hated loud noises, which is why Yoshika was no longer allowed to play the piano, because it was too loud for Rena. After Yoshika gave this light knock, she began counting in her head to 30, because Rena had told her, you do not come in right away. You knock and you wait 30 seconds at least, and then maybe I'll let you come inside. And so Yoshika, she's counting in her head, 1, 2, 3, she gets to 25, 26, 27, and then from inside the room, Rena would tell Yoshika, okay, you're allowed to enter. Yoshika very slowly reached down, she turned the knob and opened up her sister's bedroom door, and it revealed this totally dark room, this very small, cramped space. All the shades and blinds had been drawn, and Rena was sitting on her bed, completely silent. And Yoshika, she kept her head down, being very careful not to make eye contact with Rena. She didn't want to upset her. And Yoshika, she walked into the room, she made her way to the table, and she scooped up all of Rena's dirty dishes. And then Yoshika, she turned around and began walking out again, and as she did, she tried to take a quick glimpse at whatever Rena was working on in her bedroom, because Rena had told her family that she was working on this masterwork, but wouldn't really elaborate on it. And in order to work on this thing, she needed the room to be dark and the house to be silent, and she needed to focus exclusively on this masterwork, and the family needed to support her as she did this. But again, Rena just never really elaborated on what this masterwork was. She would just say that it was very special, and it would combine all the elements of her life, her spirit, her body, her soul. Even the family would be a part of building this masterwork. And when her family asked her, well, what do you mean? How can we support you in making this masterwork? Rena would just say, oh, you'll know when the time is right. Yoshika couldn't get a glimpse of the masterwork, and so she quickly turned her head back down to the ground and shuffled her way out of Rena's room and shut the door behind her. And then Yoshika, she went to the kitchen and she dumped Rena's dishes in the sink, which was totally clean to begin with, because one of Rena's rules was the house must always be immaculately clean, no dirty dish, no dust anywhere. I mean, it had to be perfect, spotless at all times, because that's the only way Rena could work on this masterwork. And so as Yoshika cleaned and dried off all of Rina's dishes and began putting them away, her brother Takahiro walked into the kitchen, and he would say to Yoshika that it was time for them to leave the house and go to the market and buy some supplies for Rina so she can continue to work on this masterwork. Yoshika was immediately totally annoyed that they had to go do this because everything was all about Rina, but she kind of buried those feelings and told her brother, okay, sure, let's go. Takahiro was different than Yoshika in how he thought about their younger sister, Rina. Yoshika totally resented Rina because now that Rina was home, Yoshika basically had to give up her career as this amazing pianist in order to support Rina in this whole master work she was working on. But Takahiro, he was totally fine giving up his writing career to just focus on supporting Rina because he really believed in Rina, and he thought that this master work she was building was going to be like the single greatest piece of art in the history of humankind. And so Takahiro felt proud to kind of be a part of it. Now, Takahiro, like the rest of his family, had no idea what this masterwork actually was, but Takahiro and Rina had a much better relationship than Yoshika and Rina, and so Rina would tell Takahiro the specific things that she needed in order to build this masterwork. And so that day, Rina had told Takahiro some things she needed, and so he and Yoshika were going to go out and get them. So Takahiro and Yoshika threw on their jackets and stepped outside, and as soon as they were out there, they both flipped their collars up and kind of concealed their faces and put their heads down because they were very careful not to make eye contact with other people. This family was already very private, but with Rina, they had been instructed to be even more private and not even really interact with the outside world. And so basically, anytime they went out in public, they would kind of hide themselves. And so Yoshika and Takahiro, they made their way to the pharmacy, they ducked their way inside, and they would purchase a bottle of surgical spirits, which is sort of like a medical alcohol. And then after buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up, headed back outside, and they went to an old used bookstore and they bought a book on palm reading, which is the art of studying the lines on your hands in order to tell someone's future. And when the brother and sister bought this book, even though the cashier was talking to them, they kept their heads down and didn't say a word to the cashier. And then after getting their book, the brother and sister hurried their way back home. And when they got there, the door was locked, but instead of pulling out a key and unlocking the door of their own home, the brother and sister knocked and they waited. And then at some point their mother came to the door and they heard 4 locks turning. The door opened up and then Yoshika and Takahiro walked inside and they shut the door and then locked again the 4 deadbolts. Rina was adamant that no one in the family could carry around a key to the house. It was too dangerous because they could potentially lose the key in town and then someone could come into their house and potentially see Rina's master work, and they couldn't have that happen. And so nobody had keys. They had to knock each time they came home. And the reason they had 4 locks on the door was, again, because Rina was very worried about somebody coming into this house and seeing what she was doing. Yoshika carried the bag with the supplies inside of it, the surgical spirits and the palm reading book, over to Rina's closed bedroom door. And instead of knocking, Yoshika just placed the bag right outside the door. She turned around and began walking away. And then as she did, she heard the sound of Rina's door opening just a crack. And Yoshika, she quickly turned around and she saw a tiny skinny arm reach out from behind the door. It grabbed the bag and then pulled the bag back into the room, and the door shut and locked. Last year, me and old Singalung were camping out on the summit of one of Louisiana's many mountaintops when suddenly we heard a small ruckus coming up the side of the mountain. Worried it was a rogue salmon who had learned to breathe air and walk on land and it was now coming up here to consume me and Singalung, we didn't hesitate. We drew our machetes and began blindly swinging them around, shredding our tent to bits and severely wounding ourselves in the process. But after those 45 minutes were up and we opened our eyes and we dropped our machetes, we looked around and realized there are no rogue fish because they don't exist. This was a bit of an overreaction. And so now, staring down a very cold and miserable night up in the mountains without our tent that we destroyed, Singalung and I did the only thing anyone would do in this situation. We signed up for DraftKings. Now, did this save us from the deadly cold that night? No, we literally died. But did it get us jacked up about the football season?
Yes! So jacked up, in fact, that I'm teaming up with DraftKings to make sure all you strange, dark, and mysterious aficionados out there get to experience the pure joy of spending an entire day constantly checking scores on your phone, only to then lose on the last leg of a 16-game parlay, sending you into an uncontrolled rage that involves you running around your dentist office, screeching like an owl. So if that sounds as appealing as I think it does, then go ahead and download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use promo code MrBallen and then bet $5 on any wager and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code MrBallen only at DraftKings Sportsbook.
Three days later, on April 18th, 2018, Yoshika was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when she overheard her brother, Takahiro, chatting with Rina. Now, Takahiro and Rina were not facing each other in the same room talking. Rina was still in her bedroom, her door was closed, and Takahiro was outside of her bedroom, and he was just sitting on the ground with his back to the door, talking through the door to Rina. Now, this was not unusual, because unlike Yoshika and Rina, who did not have a good relationship, and who really didn't talk at all, Takahiro and Rina did have a good relationship, and they would do this fairly often. They would chat through the door for like hours at a time. And so for a minute, Yoshika kind of ignored her brother and sister chatting and focused again on her book. But at some point, she began hearing what her brother was saying, and it was just totally weird. And so she put her book down and just began listening to Takahiro. And what he was saying was, how can you do that? That doesn't make any sense. How? Only your soul? How? Yoshika sensed that her brother was confused and maybe upset about something, and so she couldn't help herself. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room and looked down at her brother to see if he would kind of give her some indication of what was going on. But when Takahiro looked up and saw Yoshika, he and Rina stopped talking, and Takahiro just shook his head, stood up, and walked away. After Takahiro was gone, Yoshika very quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door, and just out of curiosity, she pressed her ear up against the wood and tried to listen to see if she could maybe hear Rina and catch something she was saying that would begin to explain what she had just overheard. But all she heard was the sound of Rina slowly shuffling towards the back of her bedroom where her bed was, and then it was totally silent. And so Yoshika moved away from the door and went back into the kitchen, and she sat down to read again, but she couldn't focus on the book because it was like this wave of sadness was just coming over her. And the reason Yoshika was feeling this way is she was thinking about the fact that back in the day when she was a kid, her and Rina used to be as close as sisters could possibly be, and for much of their lives they were very close. Even after Rina began this kind of reclusive lifestyle, they still, were friends, they interacted. But something happened in 2013, 5 years earlier, that totally severed their relationship for good. On that day, Rina had emerged from her bedroom, and Yoshika offered to read Rina's palm. This was something the two sisters did for each other periodically. It was like a way for them to bond. And so Rina held out her hand, and Yoshika took it, and she began tracing a long horizontal line across her palm. Now, Rina's hands were different than most people's hands. Rina had something called a simian line, which is a very rare thing on people's palms. It's like this long horizontal line that runs the length of your hand. In palm reading, a simian line can be either very good or very bad. It can indicate that the person is a visionary or a mystic, so that's the good side, or it can indicate that this person has a terrible disease or they're very aggressive, so that's the bad side. Rina knew she had the simian line, and she believed that it represented something good. She would say that she had a visionary soul. But on this particular day in 2013, the family had recently been banned from a local supermarket because Rina had actually gone to this market and gotten really upset with some staff members and totally lost her cool and screamed and yelled at them, and so they had been banned. And so Yoshika, thinking about this, she's looking at Rina's palm and she goes, oh, the simian line. Maybe this is why you were acting so aggressive at the supermarket. Maybe this means you're an aggressive person. But after Yoshika said this, Rina was so offended that
that she whipped her hand back and began screaming and yelling at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand the vision that I have. I'm going to show the world someday this vision, and you and those idiots down at the grocery store would never understand." And then Rina began beating and punching and kicking Yoshika, and Yoshika's screaming and trying to protect herself. And then Takahiro, the brother, had to run in and separate the two of them. Now, even though Rina was prone to these angry outbursts, this was the first time that she had lashed out physically, and so Rina's mother was concerned that Rina had some underlying condition that was causing her to lash out physically, and so she sent Rina to the doctor, and the doctor would say, you know, there is no underlying condition that led to this. However, it seems pretty clear that Rina is having some kind of psychological breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. But Rina had totally rejected this, refused to get treatment, and blamed everything on Yoshika. And then after that, Rina really stopped leaving her bedroom. She left like once every couple of months before that, but now she basically stayed in there 24/7. And at the same time, Rina had added all these new rules that her family now needed to follow to allow Rina to be able to focus on her masterwork while she was in her bedroom. And that included no one having house keys and adding those 4 locks to the door. Also, the family was told to learn the new dialect of Japanese that Rina had created. This way, no one would ever understand what they were talking about. It would kind of protect them even more from the evils of the outside world. Also, Rina made sure her family got rid of all of their telephones, their TVs, and their computers. And so Yoshika would sit in the kitchen for a bit longer, thinking about how sad it was that she had lost this relationship with her sister. And, you know, Yoshika had a lot of regret about what she had said about the Simeon line. But eventually, like always, Yoshika just kind of pushed her feelings for Rina down. And before long, Yoshika was back to reading her book. For the next several weeks, Yoshika would see her brother, Takahiro, sitting up against the door to Rina's bedroom more often than usual, having these kind of hushed conversations through the door with Rina. Also, Yoshika began to notice that Takahiro was now cooking all of Rina's meals. Normally, their mother was the one who cooked Rina's food, but now Takahiro seemed to have taken over that task entirely. As for Yoshika, because she was primarily in charge of being the one to constantly clean the house, that meant she was the one going into Rina's bedroom and collecting her dirty dishes. And as soon as Takahiro had begun being the cook for Rina, Yoshika began to notice that more and more food was being left on Rina's plates. Basically, Rina wasn't eating as much food as she normally did, and this started to worry Yoshika. Rina was already a very small person. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, barely 90 pounds, and Yoshika worried that, you know, she really needs to eat. She's already so small, she can't afford to miss meals. And then one day in the middle of May, Yoshika went into Rina's bedroom and she saw all of her dishes were basically completely filled with the food she had been given. She basically had not touched them. And Yoshika, she really never actually spoke to Rina when she was in the bedroom, but this time she just couldn't help herself. And without even looking at Rina, Yoshika, she gathered up the plates full of food and she said, "Rina, you need to eat more of your food." Rina didn't say anything back, and Yoshika, she just quickly turned and walked out of the room. But after that interaction, Takahiro would tell Yoshika that Rina doesn't want you going in her room ever again. And so from now on, the dishes that you would normally collect, Rina will place them right outside of the door. That way, you don't have to go inside that room. Also, around the same time, Rina, who normally would only leave her bedroom to go use the bathroom, well, she began going to the bathroom exclusively at night when her family was asleep to avoid any interaction with them. And so by this point, Rina's interactions with her family were reduced to basically zero. By early August, Takahiro and Yoshika were being sent to the store more and more often by Rina to get more of these surgical spirits, the medical alcohol. Now, neither Takahiro nor Yoshika had any idea what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they knew it was their duty to support her, and so they kept buying them. And what they would do is they would come back home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door, and he would tuck the bottle inside, and then Rina would take it, the door would shut, and then Rina would never give them her empty bottle. Basically, the bottle went in, and it stayed inside. Then, on August 18th of 2018, Takahiro and Rina appeared to get in some kind of a fight.
Yoshika was in the kitchen and she saw that Takahiro was sitting against the door of Rina's bedroom, and the two were having kind of a hushed conversation. And then at some point, Takahiro stood up and he turned around and faced the door and kind of yelled into it, "I told you your soul was not enough." And then Rina said something back to him, at which point Takahiro said, "No, please, please," as if he was kind of begging with Rina to change her mind. And then before Yoshika could come over and ask Takahiro what was going on, Takahiro just opened up Rina's bedroom door and walked inside, and suddenly the house went completely silent. Yoshika was too nervous to walk over and look inside of the room, and so she just stayed in the kitchen and listened. And for 15 minutes, it was absolute silence. And then Takahiro walked out of Rina's bedroom, shut the door behind him, and he looked very calm. And at this point, Yoshika looked over at him and said, "What's going on?" And Takahiro, he would just smile and tell Yoshika that Rina's masterwork is nearly completed. And then Takahiro asked Yoshika if she remembered when Rina had said, at some point her masterwork was going to require some direct help from the family, but she said, we'll know when the time is right for us to participate. And Yoshika would say, "Yes, I remember that." And Takahiro said, "Well, the time is now." Then Takahiro told Yoshika that they had to go to the store and get more surgical spirits. And so really without questioning him, Yoshika went with him. They went to the store and they would purchase 3 times the normal amount of surgical spirits that they normally would. And then when they got home, Takahiro alone would go into Rina's bedroom with these surgical spirits. He would shut the door behind him, and Yoshika just sat in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until Takahiro came out again, no longer carrying these surgical spirits, and he would come over to Yoshika and he would say, "Rina is ready to reconcile with you. She wants you to sit by the door and talk to her. And if you do that, you can be more involved in creating her masterwork." And at this news, Yoshika felt a mixture of frustration and relief. She had never thought it was fair that Rina had so completely cut her off after that 2013 Simeon line joke she made while palm reading. Also, Rina had made Yoshika's life so difficult for so long. I mean, Yoshika had basically been forced to give up her dreams of playing the piano, and she had to give up her friends and all of her life ambitions and goals to just support Rina. But despite all of that, deep down, Yoshika missed Rina terribly. They did used to be so close. She wanted to have that relationship again. And so Yoshika walked over to Rina's closed bedroom door. She sat down against it, and at first, she didn't say anything, and Rina didn't say anything either. But then at some point, it was like the floodgates just opened, and Yoshika kind of began pouring her heart out about how sad she was, about how her and Rina's relationship had really gone south and how she wanted to fix it. And now normally, on the rare times that Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it up to drop something off or whatever it was, oftentimes Rina would just start banging on something inside of the room, kind of to tell Yoshika to stop talking and go away. But as Yoshika sat there pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, the one thing Yoshika noticed was there was no pounding coming from inside the room. Rina was listening to her. And then the next day, after Yoshika and Takahiro had gone to the store again and gotten more surgical spirits and brought them back to the house, instead of just Takahiro being allowed to enter Rina's bedroom, this time Yoshika was allowed to join. And so Takahiro and Yoshika, they went into the dark bedroom, and Rina was laying on the bed, and they walked over to her, and Takahiro showed Yoshika what they needed to do. It was the last step of this masterwork project that Rina was working on. They basically needed to rub these surgical spirits all over Rina's body. Now, Yoshika didn't really understand why they were doing this, but she respected that this was part of Rina's plan, and frankly, Yoshika was just happy to be included in creating this masterwork, and so she didn't really ask any questions. And so after the brother and sister had rubbed this alcohol all over Rina for about 10 minutes, they walked back outside, they shut the door, and then Yoshika, she stayed back and sat down against the door and kind of poured her heart out again to Rina, and it was just very therapeutic. And in many ways, this was the first time that Yoshika was feeling happy again. I mean, she was finally starting to repair this relationship with Rina. And so over the next several weeks, this became Yoshika's new daily routine. Her and her brother would get all these surgical spirits, they'd come home, they'd rub them all over Rina, and then over the course of the day, Yoshika would stop by the door and chat with Rina through it, and that was it.
And then on September 25th, 2018, after Yoshika and Takahiro had applied the surgical spirits to Rina's body, Yoshika told Rina that she had a very special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a really good mood this day because, one, she was feeling really good about her new relationship with her sister, but also, two, when she had gone to the pharmacy earlier with her brother, normally they didn't have any interaction with the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits, mostly because Yoshika and her brother did their best to kind of like hide themselves and make it very clear they were not looking to talk. But on this particular day, the pharmacist had been very talkative and was trying to talk to Yoshika, and Yoshika, she decided she would talk back. Now, their conversation was not very substantive. Basically, the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, why are you buying all these surgical spirits? And Yoshika would say, oh, they're for my sister Rina, and, she needs more and more of them every day, and, she's working on something special, and we don't really know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know whatever she's doing, it's going to be worth it. And so even though this conversation seems kind of meaningless, for Yoshika, who had virtually no contact with other people, it was great having that little talk. And so when she came home, she just felt ready to do something special for Rina. And so after Yoshika and Takahiro had left Rina's bedroom after applying these surgical spirits, Yoshika went to go give Rina her surprise. And so Yoshika, she walked over to the family piano that was not far from Rina's bedroom door. And Yoshika, she was nervous, but she sat down on the bench and she opened up the lid and she placed her fingers on the keys. Yoshika's big surprise was she was going to play a song called The Waltz of the Flowers, which is a famous piece of classical music that was inspired by the composer's love for his sister. And so Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to finally play in this house for Rina. She'll see that I love her so much. And so Yoshika, she began to play the song, and as she did, she was constantly listening to see if Rina would start banging on something to tell Yoshika to stop. But again, she didn't. It was quiet. And so Yoshika, she played this beautiful song. And then when it was all over, again, Yoshika's listening carefully for Rina to yell out or be mad that she's playing this loud music in the house. But it was just quiet. And so again, Yoshika just felt this closeness to her sister. And before long, Yoshika felt tears of happiness coming down her cheeks. But then, as Yoshika closed the lid of the piano, she did hear a banging, but it wasn't coming from Rina's bedroom, it was coming from the front door. And then a moment later, Yoshika heard someone scream from outside the front door, "Police, open up!" But before Yoshika could go to the door to open it, her mother had ran to the door. She opened all 4 locks, but then only opened it a crack and tried to yell at the police to go away, go away. But the police, they were kind of pushing on the door, trying to get the mother to get out of the way. And Yoshika, she kind of moved over and looked through the crack, and she saw it wasn't just a couple of police officers. It was a whole army of police officers and firefighters and EMTs. There was an ambulance. And then before long, the police officer that had been yelling, open up, he finally just pushed and got the door open all the way. And then a swarm of people in uniforms flooded the home. And as soon as all these officers were in the house, they immediately began opening up every door like they were looking for something. And then finally they got to Rina's bedroom and they opened the door. And as soon as they did, Yoshika watched as the officers just stopped at the doorway and they began cussing and yelling and turning their faces away. And then the officers went into Rina's bedroom. And then a minute later, they began talking on their radio. And then EMTs came into the house with a stretcher. They went into Rina's bedroom. And then before long, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched as the stretcher came out again with these officers and EMTs, and on the stretcher was Rina, and she looked terrible. Her eyes were sunken back in her head, and her skin was so pale it was practically see-through. I mean, really, she just kind of looked like a skeleton. The real story of what happened inside of that family's home would quickly become international news. And not because Rina was secretly creating a masterwork of art in her bedroom. Here's what really happened. Rina stopped eating food in April of 2018. She would say that the only thing she needed to be nourished was her visionary soul. And so basically, because she had this visionary soul, she didn't need food. That was the conversation that Yoshika had overheard between Takahiro and Rina when Takahiro was saying, "Only your soul? How? Well, he was trying to figure out how Rina was going to survive by being nourished by her soul. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward 4 months to August 18th, and again, Yoshika had overheard her brother and her sister talking through the bedroom door, except on this day, it sounded like Takahiro was fighting with Rina, because at some point he had stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul wasn't enough!" And then he had busted inside of Rina's bedroom and stayed in there in silence for 15 minutes, only to come back out again and very calmly tell Yoshika that, don't worry, Rina is nearing the end of her masterwork, and we just need to go out and get her more surgical spirits. Well, it would turn out the reason Takahiro was mad and yelled through the door at Rina is because he was trying to talk to her through the door and she wasn't talking back. And he suspected it was because she wasn't eating, and so he had yelled at her about that and then barged into her room only to find Rina totally unresponsive, not moving, not talking, nothing. And so he just stood there wondering what to do. And so as Takahiro is standing there, it clicks for him that now is the time. Now's the time to get involved. And so Takahiro left the bedroom, he grabbed Yoshika, they went to the pharmacy, they got more surgical spirits, they came back, and Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom and covered her head to toe in these spirits, because that was something she had wanted him to do before, and he believed that that's what she needed right now, because she can't talk, she can't move, she needs more of these spirits. That's going to help her visionary soul nourish her while she completes this master work. And for the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika would continue to apply these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her complete her master work. On September 25th, when Yoshika and Takahiro were at the pharmacy getting more spirits, the reason this pharmacist finally struck up a conversation with Yoshika is because over time, the pharmacist had noticed that every time they came in to buy these surgical spirits, they smelled so bad. And on this particular day, when they came in, the stench was just overwhelming. And so the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, like, what are these surgical spirits for? And Yoshika would give this totally weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on this master work in her bedroom and it was all going to be worth it. And so when Yoshika and Takahiro had left that day, the pharmacist was just so weirded out and alarmed by them that he called the police. And when the police arrived at the family's home, they discovered that Rina was not building a masterwork in her bedroom, she was just dead in her bed, and had been for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18th, which is the day that Takahiro came into the room and discovered her unresponsive, which meant there was never any reconciliation happening between Yoshika and Rina. It's unclear why Takahiro had told Yoshika, hey, Rina's ready to reconcile with you, because again, Rina was dead at the time, so there's no way she would have said anything to him. And so when Yoshika was having these supposed heart-to-hearts through the door with her sister or playing music for her, that wasn't real. The only real thing that was happening is Yoshika and Takahiro, from August 18th until the end of September when the police busted into their home, they would spend nearly every day rubbing this weird medical alcohol all over their dead sister's body because that's what they believed she wanted, when in reality, all this alcohol was doing was actually mummifying her body. Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother were all charged with preventing a proper and decent burial. As for Rina, her cause of death could not actually be determined, but based on what she looked like, they assumed she died from starvation. The court would eventually drop the charges against the family, saying that basically the family was too mentally ill to stand trial. And this was because the court had discovered that Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother actually had not accepted that Rina was dead. They believed she was actually still alive, that all the work they had done rubbing those spirits on her had nourished her soul, and she was still working on this master work. And as of a few years ago, the family is still living in that same cottage, and it's not clear if they ever actually came to understand that Rina was in fact dead.